Move myself up here. So here we are, the European Renaissance. I got a lot of static from calling it that in the beginning because people just usually don't put a "the" on it, but there are several Renaissances, so I wanted to distinguish. Anyhow, there's going to be 6 sessions, as per usual. This one, session 1, is going to be on the socio-economic underpinnings of Renaissance culture, sort of the background leading in. The take on the whole course, if you read that blurb that was out in the catalog, is essentially the Renaissance is usually treated as an artistic and intellectual moment in Western development, and it's usually done isolated from what I really think of as the material culture, what the real world was doing at the time, and I wanted to give it a much heftier context and draw a wider focus and not just talk about artistic characteristics or the like, even though we will talk about some of that. The second session is going to specifically talk about the revival of classical humanism, so-called secular humanism in the 14th century. Third session, wealth patronage and collecting in the 15th century, because collecting is going to be the key into the angle into some of the insights I hope to score with the course in general. The fourth session, Brave New World, printing, exploration, and reformation. Fifth session, Renaissance philosophy and the nature of man. And then the last one, I just called it Renaissance Reformation and the paradoxes of modernism, because I really believe the multiplicity of alternatives that we have in the modern world was a characteristic of the Renaissance. People could be secular and religious in different ways simultaneously. And that's exactly what we find ourselves in the modern world. Anyhow, so let's get to the first session. Why Renaissance? I think some of you who were there for a humanism class that I taught once upon a time have seen this slide before. The traditional account is that classical Rome was wealthy and had an intense high culture, inherited much of the intellectual curriculum of the Greek world, and that it became watered down and lost through stages that included first imperial decadence, and then barbarian incursions into the empire, and then finally the decline and fall of the empire, resulting in a barbarized culture of the so-called Dark Ages. And we come to the proper Middle Ages proper, and it's an age of faith, and the secular world has been lost. But then suddenly in the 14th century, according to the traditional account, we have a rebirth. So we're headed back to the bright yellow of the classical world recovered. And with it, we get those characteristics of ancient intellectual culture, secular humanism, individualism, as we like to think of it, and in art, representationalism. And one of the points that I want to stress through the first couple of sessions is that not everything from the Roman world had disappeared. In fact, very much the stuff was still around. And I just want to jump to the next slide. They would have still been able to see artifacts from the ancient world, whether they're panel paintings done in Egypt, like the two on the left, or statues of Augustus, or just some senatorial statues or men on the street, as we see on the right. It was there, but there was a shift of focus in the Dark Ages and the so-called Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. The artifacts themselves had not really disappeared, but in the Middle Ages, there was simply little interest in representational art because they were busy pursuing a different program. if you will. And that program had very little to do with representational art and had everything to do with the content message of Christianity. So it was a shift in emphasis in the Middle Ages that got reshifted during the Renaissance. So so you have two pietas here. You have one that's I'm not really sure. I know which abbey it comes from, but it's either 12th or 13th century. It isn't that people entirely had lost an interest in classical technique in Western Europe, even though the training wasn't there anymore, and the wealth that supported the pursuit of that training wasn't there anymore. But the real focus was on the next life, the afterlife, the life of the soul, as pointed to by Judeo-Christianity and later Islam itself. The loss of representationality, and as you see in Michelangelo's Pietà on the right, was of little concern. It isn't. In the Byzantine world, you had some people trying to reconstruct that sort of thing, but in the West, not really. So the individual, the human body in medieval art is a cipher. It stands in for a content. It's a message. It's not a goal in itself. If you will, the accurate depiction of the three-dimensional depiction of the body. And I've used this slide before. People have seen this. The shift in emphasis towards representation can be seen in these three treatments of the same New Testament story, which is the lamentation of Christ. He's been taken down from the cross. The women are surrounding the body. It's before the body's placed in the tomb. We see a medieval representation on the left. You get the content, you get the message, basically stick figures. And then you begin by the early 14th century. So we have a Giotto, and you see representationalism. I can get us in a little closer to take a peek at that. You can see the beginnings of what will come to be high Renaissance representationalism. And then we see in the late 15th century this Mantegna with the foreshortening, which is, if you will, almost purely a secular point of view. The study of the body, not the study of the sacrifice of Christ, in effect, is the message by the time we get to the Mantegna. So there are the 2 points I want to make here there are continuities with medieval practice. Subject matter is still religious. Gospel and Old Testament themes still are the dominant themes. We are not yet in the world of still lifes with bunches of grapes and dead pheasants hanging from a hook. We're not there yet. There's a tremendous intensity of feeling in much of Renaissance art, as there was in medieval art. But there's also this new continuity with classical practice, medieval practice. The individual human body in and of itself is of interest, and form, in some senses, precedes substance. The message is subordinate to technique. If you've ever seen the sculpture of the Cristo Velato in Naples, where the body is under a draped cloth and it's chiseled out of marble, and you think there is a cloth over this body. I mean, you want to reach out and lift it off. You can tell the artist is concerned purely with technique and purely with impressing the audience with the technique. Now, I want to, in pointing to one of the themes of the class, I want to step back and look at something of a progression through artwork on one theme. And the theme, it's because I want to point to a particular painting that we'll get to in a couple of slides, And the theme I want to pick out for this purpose are scenes of the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel coming to Mary and saying, you have been chosen to be the Mater Dei, the Mother of God, the Mother of Jesus, but the church will exalt it, as we've spoken of in other courses on Christianity and the like, will exalt it into the idea of the Mother of God, the bearer of God, the Theotokos, as she is called in the Greek church, the God bearer. Here is Gabriel speaking to Mary in the catacomb of Priscilla in the Roman period, and there are none of the later conventions in place. The angel doesn't have wings. None of the medieval symbology that will develop over the next 1,000 years is in place. There's no fountain, and there are no flowers, and there's no well, and there's no dove. All sorts of things are missing, but it will grow. So, in a Russian icon of the 12th century, we see the winged Gabriel, and a Byzantine icon of the 13th century. Already we see her enthroned with the suggestion that this is going to be the Mother of God, not just the Mother of Jesus. And then we see the introduction of things like flowers. All of the symbology that came to layer the story of the Annunciation will be in place in the later treatment. So flowers symbolize Mary's purity. The dove at Mary's ear is a symbol of the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. The well symbolizes Mary as the fountain, the fons vitae, the fountain of life. The throne symbolizes Mary's unique and special status. This is on the wall of San Marco in Venice, so probably executed by Byzantine artists. And then this lovely one is in Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome. In the Renaissance, it's still going to be treated traditionally, despite the fact that you have now attempts at depth of perspective and the like. You can go to the Friary of San Marco in Florence and see Fra Angelico's Annunciation, and it is still essentially a sacred treatment. So it isn't as if the Renaissance just stops using the religious themes or the sense of religious intensity that you would have found in the medieval world. You will still, throughout the Renaissance, find devotional treatments like the Fra Angelico, who himself is a brother. So here is a man of God who takes the tradition very seriously, but incorporates some of the new painting techniques in the fresco. And if you've never visited that friary, it's spectacular, because the cells are very simple and these little white cubes, and in the middle of them you'll get these wonderful little frescoes. So in the 15th century, with artists in the north of Europe like Boots, and with a grand stylist like Sandro Botticelli and the Cestello Annunciation, and now we're in the 1480s and 1490s, you will still get the essential religious story, even though in the Botticelli there is the suggestion of Mary as the blushing teenage girl who has to be charmed into the idea of becoming the Blessed Mother. But the basic outlines of the religious message are still in place. All of this in contrast with what I want to look at next, and one of the points I really want to make. And I want to use for that purpose this painting by Carlo Crivelli, a Venetian-born artist who spends his entire career in the Marche, that zone east of Umbria on the Adriatic coast in central Italy, a marvelously beautiful province. And in its capital city, one of its capital cities, one of its municipal centers, Ascoli Piceno, he becomes the sort of the king of local artists. And in this painting, which we're going to look at fairly closely, I'm just giving you the broad sense right now. Here's Mary in the room. The angel is with Saint Emilius, who happens to be the patron saint of Ascoli. And the civic focus of this boosterous advertisement for the city has come to the fore. Suddenly, instead of being in a biblical story of the announcement, the Great Annunciation, all of which is still in the picture, there's still symbols of wealth, indications of civic glory. Here's a city, by the way, this city, even today, is only about 50,000 people. So this is, if you will, this is Atchison, Kansas, showing off to the people who want to visit from the big city. Look, we are wealthy. Look what we have. Look at our Turkish carpets. Look at our Renaissance ceilings. Look at our pilasters. Look at the streets that are lined with stone, not dirt paths. So this celebration of civic pride in the economic well-being of the city is like the purpose of the painting. And what we're going to find is that a lot of Renaissance production isn't the product of artistic inspiration. I know in the 21st century, ever since the 19th century, we like to think of the artist sitting up on Mount Parnassus and being inspired from inside the artist's breast and producing this glorious invention that is the artwork. This is more like modern movie making, in which the studio or the patron, top down, has its interests at heart and hires someone who you may think of as an artist, but they may think of as a craftsperson. I'm hiring a clever carpenter. I'm hiring a clever painter. And we'll even later on look at contracts between patrons and painters and the like. This is in the modern world, art being generated out of civic, secular, and financial concerns, much as it would be in what we think of as the modern world. So the angel Gabriel seems to be in conversation with Emilius, who, as you notice, is holding a model of the city. Okay. Just in case we were going to miss the point, Crivelli never allows you to miss the point. By the way, there are Crivellis in all these little churches all over the Marche. And it's worth sometimes driving up to the top of a mountain to get to some little town where there's a church that's 50 feet long just to see a Crivelli on the wall. The inscription at the bottom says Libertas Ecclesiastica. Church liberty refers to the self-governance of the city under church auspices. There is the motto. Okay. At the bottom are the flanking coats of arms of Pope Sixtus the Fourth, and the local bishop in the Marche, who may have been the bishop of Ascoli or who may have been the bishop of Ancona, I'm not sure. There are the traditional elements, so he doesn't do away with them altogether. There's the requisite dove, there's the spiritual ray of light. Here's the dove, and there's the ray of light. The apple down here at the bottom refers to the fall of Adam and Eve. And the cucumber, no one's ever explained this to me. I've seen it before. I've never quite understood. The cucumber symbolizes resurrection. You tell me. I'm not sure why, but we have the fall and the resurrection. There's a flask of pure water up here in Mary's room, standing for Mary's virginity. And of course, peacocks are always a symbol of immortality and salvation and redemption. The peacock rises again. The peacock's even better than the phoenix. The total focus is secular. The rendering and scale of the architecture and the elaborately rich furnishings overwhelm the religious narrative. This is a homage to the high consumer ideals of a prosperous provincial city. We see the neighborhood, we see the good citizens, they're pretty well dressed, they have their formal Sunday garb on. There are archways with I didn't mean to get us there. There are archways with wonderful relief work. The interior is just spectacular. The wood paneling with the grain. The dish. These items, by the way, are not just, look at the combination. A book, some plates, jars, drapery. This is this kind of potpourri of rich stuff, acquisitions of a wealthy person, all in play, well done pillows, the damask work on the curtains, the ceiling, the renderings of the ceiling, the plate, a book, whether it was, and this is 1480 something, so it could have been printed. It could have been one of the so-called incunabula. We'll talk about that in a couple of sessions. And it may have been a manuscript entirely. In either case, if we're talking the 1480s, this is an object of great wealth and cost. And then Mary herself, again, the clothing, the jewelry, the bedspread, the reading stand, the printed work, and this is probably a missal text because you see red printing and black printing, and sacred words were always in one color, and the commentary was always in the other color. But embroidery surrounding Mary, this is a picture of success. This is a bragging right for the city. This is a tribute to Ascoli Piceno itself. And then outside, I want to point to, you're going to see this in a number, and we'll talk about it later on in this session, and a number of other painters as well, renderings of Turkish carpets, what the English would have called Turkey carpets at the time, done so faithfully that carpet historians use the paintings of Crivelli as well as Lotto and Holbein, I'll talk about that later, to track the development of patterns. So they'll look at some paintings and say, see, this was extant in the 1480s. They'll look at a Holbein later on and say, you see what's happened by 1532 or 1533, another development. historians of all sorts of objects would use paintings of Crivelli and others to vet the techniques that were being used at the times. Look at the, to get us there. I keep on hitting the wrong button. Sorry, folks. Look at the renderings in the background. Look at the shadowing of the peacock. So yes, he is showing off technique as well, and again, it's a point of civic pride. Not only look what we have, look at how well we're doing, but look at the kind of painter we can afford in our local civic paradise. Anyhow, how did we get here? Just to go quickly in a few slides to do some background. We know the classical world evaporated after the fall of the empire. And this map here is Europe at the death of Charlemagne. We're in 814. And if you notice on the bottom, I make this point, the caliphate, which now dominates all of North Africa and up into Spain, the Emirate of Cordoba, has cut Western Europe off from the Mediterranean. The only people who will still have contact, as we will see, will be elements of what is then not yet Italy, but is the Italian boot, and we'll talk about that. After the fall of the empire, the social developments and the economic developments were the decentralization, so the collapse of population. By Charlemagne, Rome was maybe 25,000 people. So it went in about a century and a half at one point from, let's say, the year 430, 420, 430, but it may have still been about 400,000 then, and it collapses to 25,000, as do all other cities. I mean, there just aren't cities. There's extreme localism, which is why you have a feudal society. It's basically gang leaders who are local lords who then form partnerships with higher lords and through the institution of feudality and fealty. And in effect, the neighborhood is carved up. It's Chicago in the 1920s or 30s. So a deurbanized, localized, isolated world with small pockets of military competence, serfs working the land, and churchmen, the last representatives of high culture, and not all of them. So there's a strict contraction. It's only in the monasteries that you have anything close to education going on. And the monasteries in certain episcopal centers, bishop canons in certain cities. The libraries into the Middle Ages are maintained entirely by churchmen. What does this mean then? That the preservation of classical culture is going to undergo a very strict and extensive selective preservation. Only books are going to be copied that are relevant to the purposes and lives of the people who are doing the preserving. In this case, that means we now have this depopulated, isolated, heavily Christianized, uneducated world, and only works of theological, devotional, certain philosophical texts, insofar as they support Christian theory at one level or another. Those are the books that are going to be copied. You're going to go from saint to saint. You'll find manuscripts that have, pentamentos, that were scraped, yet Plato scraped off and overwritten by, the life of Saint Martin of Tours, or other devotional works of Roman martyrs, kind of thing. The Roman writers, the Roman Republic and then the early empire, in which all careers of significance were done in political and business arenas, the literature of which, in a society like that, was going to engage all those topics: how to speak well, how to give speeches in the Senate, what is the education of the young person on the make in the Roman world, all the letters of Cicero to addressing interests like that. All of that is going to be entirely ignored in the medieval period, because there is nothing comparable to Roman Republican or imperial society in the West. Those works would have made no sense. And you see this map of Western Europe in 1300 with Cluniac monasteries and Cistercian monasteries. These centers that would have preserved culture aren't interested in Roman civic literature. They're the only places you're going to get copies made. And those are going to be copies of religious works and patristic, meaning the fathers of the church, as the dominant text. And they're going to be Latin texts, because the use of Greek, once the West has been cut off from the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, after the year 600 or so, once that occurs, the only places we find some knowledge of Greek cropping up are in these out-of-the-way Irish monasteries, believe it or not, in the 8th century. And nobody knows how it got there. But it's going to be largely in Latin. Here we have a picture of Cistercian copyists. And of course, the copies were usually made with somebody reading, often with someone reading aloud, and 6 or 7 copies taking down what was said and making marginal notes and making mistakes and getting things wrong. And so there was a lot of text corruption in the period, as well as preservation. So you had this shift in focus away from secular topics, which would have been the Roman or Greek topics. Then in the 12th century, there is something of a Renaissance, but it's the High Middle Ages, and it's done under the influence of the new universities and the philosophers who are busy recovering from the Arab world translations of the Greek literature, the Greek curriculum, that had been lost to them in direct Greek. In other words, what happened was, and I'm really talking about the central bullet on this page, Greek and Arab science, medicine, and philosophy had made it into the Arabic language under Arab high culture in the 9th century, and therefore made it to Spain when the Emirate of Cordoba became a significant society in the 8th century and 9th century. So all of these Greek texts that no longer really existed in the monastic libraries, some of them existed, people couldn't read Greek, they didn't know what they were sitting on shelves. And so people interested in it in the new universities, places being founded like Oxford and University of Paris, sent translators or people to help with the translation down to Spain, to the Arab sources, where Jewish and Arab scholars helped them translate from Arabic into Latin, and they brought it back. So these things were, if you can imagine how corrupt the texts were, because you had translations from Greek to Aramaic to or Syriac to Arabic, which were then being translated from Arabic back into one of the Romance languages of Spain in the 12th century, and then into Latin. So you had about a 5-language assembly line getting these sources back into something that could be read by the universities. But what it meant was that in this Renaissance, in the 12th century Renaissance, that there would be some attempt at high culture, but that attempt would largely be in the arena of philosophy and theology. And I want to point out, the High Middle Ages is a golden age for the development of Western philosophy, with Thomas Aquinas, with William of Ockham, with Duns Scotus, with numbers, with Peter Abelard. But in fact, much more well-developed a set of achievements in philosophy than we're going to find in the Renaissance. But it's still not engaged in secular or commercial culture, the high culture of the 12th century Renaissance, mainly because you still don't have the need for it. So, in the first bullet up here, I point to the development of Gothic architecture. Here's a picture of Sainte-Chapelle. The great expansion of libraries and manuscript production, the great monastic congregations of Cluny and Citeaux. And there is a heyday of philosophical, theological, even certain kinds of scientific thought, but not commercial activity as such. The intellectual life of the period centers on Plato and Neoplatonism and on Aristotle, and as the great rival of Plato, who becomes the interest to, among others, Thomas Aquinas and the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon. Latin was extended as a technical language in this period to accommodate the new philosophy, but classical Latin, literary Latin, was entirely ignored. Nobody's going to read Catullus. No one's going to read Cicero to try to figure out how to write a letter. No one's interested in Virgil's poetry or Ovid's poetry. The historians, the poets, and the political thinkers of Rome were not important in this 12th century yet. Then, at the same time, in this late period, you begin to develop urban cultures that will support interests that lead to the Renaissance. So you'll find, going from left to right here, you'll find this great aggregation of population in Spain, but this is still an Arab world in southern Spain, south of Castile and south of Aragon. And then you will find the great trading region of East Anglia, London, all the way through the Low Countries in northern France, and you'll find cities. You see the red squares are the only towns with 50,000 people. Okay? Nothing big. The yellow places, the yellow dots are towns of 10 to 50,000, and the sort of reddish brown area color means the whole region was heavily populated. And in both places, the place in Northern Europe, the area in Northern Europe, and the area in Northern Italy are places where nationalist or imperial control, the Holy Roman Empire, France, or in Italy, really the Kingdom of Sicily and the Papal States had very little control. So a lot of the cities in these areas are relatively independent. And this is in Italy, it's the realm and the period of the great condottieri, the professional mercenaries who were hired by cities in their warfare with other cities for commercial dominance. So you have city culture, the kind of city culture that would have produced the Crivelli painting we were looking at. Cities proud of themselves, standing tall and saying, we're somebody to be reckoned with. It's in these areas that you're going to see this urbanization of the late Middle Ages is going to be the center for Renaissance art. It's going to be the Low Countries, and it's going to be northern Italy, northern and central Italy. And early on, the center is really going to be northern Italy. And you see in this map, it's a pastiche of duchies and a pastiche of local influences. There aren't real, I mean, the Kingdom of Naples is not a dominant kingdom. It controls a lot of territory, but there isn't a lot of high civilization taking place here. And the Papal States do have some places of note, but you see the more independent states like Florence, Venice, Genoa, these are the places that will become the largest players in the Renaissance world. Why was Italy the center of the Renaissance? Well, there are political reasons. One is what I've just been pointing to. There's no dominant political or commercial entity. You have distributed power centers, France, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy. This is the era of the so-called rivalry between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, or the houses of Weiblingen and Welf in the German Empire of the North, the Holy Roman Empire. These were the two families vying for dominance. And what the Italian city-states had learned, these little republics, is how to play one side off the other. So you would find families in Florence who would side with the Guelphs, and others that would side with the Ghibellines. So they had their own sort of House of Representatives infighting within the cities proper. And they could use this to playing off the two parties to maintain their independence from a single dominant state like the Holy Roman Empire. So these so-called free city-states and republics had shifting alliances. But the most important function, from our point of view, was that they were banking centers and they controlled the Mediterranean trade routes. So if you look at this map on the lower right, you will see that Italy is well positioned for trade with what's left of Byzantium, trade with the Levant and the silk and spice roads coming out of Asia, where things would be carried out of India and China, brought to the Red Sea, boated across, make their way to Damascus, which is why certain materials are called damask, because they're imported from Damascus, and then brought back to Italy by boat, and then through overland passes taken to north, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, a little bit of West Germany, a little bit of northern France, where they could be traded for finished textiles using wool that was grown and aggregated in England and made into garments and tapestries and what have you in the Low Countries, and could be trade items that would then be returned eastward again. And so this trade was going to be dominated by Genoa, Venice, and Pisa. And we'll see in this map, this is a map looking at the entire Mediterranean in 1400 or so. And I want to point out, first of all, if you look at that pink color, what's left of the Byzantine Empire? It's this little bit, Constantinople, and a little bit on the European side of the Bosphorus, this little bit around Thessalonica, and this little bit in the Peloponnese, which after the fall of Constantinople will hold out for about another 60 years. In Mistra, there'll be the emperor of Constantinople will make his way here. And this is why in the period, Greek is going to make its way back to Italy, because as this purplish, light, I don't even know what you call the color, that light mauve or whatever it is the Byzantine or the Ottoman Empire that's surrounding Constantinople, will take it in 1453. The walls of Constantinople will finally not be able to protect them. And in the 1430s and 40s, there will be many emissaries from the Byzantine Greek world coming to the courts of Italy to try to persuade them to militarily help Constantinople resist the final onslaught of the Ottomans. Understanding that, the Italians, the Venetians in particular, really didn't have much interest in helping the Greek world out, because you see where this bright blue are really, these are really extended colonies of Venice, and they are well embedded within the Ottoman world and doing significant amounts of trade with the Ottoman world at this point in time. They have very little interest in saying, we're going to turn on our major trading partners to help our fellow religionists, our fellow Christians in Constantinople and Thessalonica, resist the Turks. And you see in the Republic of Genoa, in that dark yellowish thing, and you see how much they control in the Black Sea. These are actual colonies of Genoa. And so, and in this little map at the bottom here, I just highlighted trade routes, the green ones being Venetian trade routes, and the Genoese actually making it through Gibraltar and going up to England and getting to they were probably, the Genoese were probably better sailors than the Venetians. They made it to more places. So we have a world by 1400 where the concentration of wealth is, as far as Europe is concerned, is Mediterranean based, and it's in trade relations between the Ottoman Empire largely and the major Italian city-states. And I make a number of comments here on what some of those trade relationships were. The Venetians traded heavily with the Mamluks of Egypt. This is by the way, the Islamic control of North Africa and all the way to Spain was not monolithic. There were many different, these were like separate states that were rivalries. So the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt is going to be absorbed eventually by the Ottomans, but at this stage it's not. So here, all the way up into the Levant, what we would call Israel and Palestine and Lebanon and Syria. So in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Mamluk Sultanate spanned what is now Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Venice exported copper and brass. Copper, by the way, was much in demand in 1400 because it was significant in the production of early weaponry. A lot of big guns were made out of brass. Copper was useful to the amalgams that were used. And so copper mining was one of the sources of wealth, as we shall see, for the Fugger banking family, who made gazillions funding the wars between the emperor in Vienna, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Ottomans, and sort of supplying warfare becomes the major function of bankers in the Renaissance period. So they exported copper and brass to the Mamluk Sultanate. In return, they got some fine textiles. We saw some of these damasks and silks and the like. Spices, the cost of which was mind-boggling. The money that was made in places like Genoa for pepper was just incredible. Medicines, pigments, precious stones, glass, paper. Paper was still, well produced in the Egyptian world. Mamluk artisans were famous for bookbinding, fine inlaid metalwork. Their designs became so prevalent in the Venetian luxury market, and we're going to be talking a lot about luxury markets, that later historians suspected that Egyptian workers actually set up workshops in Venice, that they actually imported craftspeople from this part of the world. This little baptistry of St. Louis was used to baptize members of the French royal family for like 5 centuries. And it came from the Mamluk world. This enamel work. On the left, just a bottle. On the right, a mosque lamp. And when you look at the lamps of places like San Marco, you see this level of execution, this level of craft. Venetian trade in general was heavily dependent on the goodwill of the Ottomans. And here's a quote from a Venetian: "Be merchants, we cannot live without them." So when asked to engage in military support against the Ottomans, you can see why the Venetians and the Genoese demurred. It was like biting the hand that would feed them. So in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman Empire dominated former Byzantine territories in Anatolia, in the Levant, and on the European mainland. Constantinople is going to fall in 1453. Venetian and Ottoman trade interests were so enmeshed that formal trade agreements were set by treaty. Later on, one of the things, I think I show it on one of the slides, at the point, much later on, at the point that the Ottoman Sultan, the great Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was trying to capture Vienna and had a major army outside two sieges of Vienna. At one point, as a political device, sort of a photo op device, he had a crown that was also a helmet. It was sort of halfway between a tiara like the Pope wears and a military helmet made by Venetian craftspeople on contract to impress the defenders of Vienna. So unless you think of this as a kind of world of crusaders in which Christians were all aligned on one side and Muslims on the other, here was the Sultan of, at that point, Istanbul, no longer Constantinople, contracting for what would today be tens of millions of dollars. You'll see what this helmet looks like. For this object that would bankrupt, a billionaire, to show that he is really the new master of the world outside the gates of Vienna, which he's never able to breach, as it turns out. But the whole idea that you would have Venetian contract workers working day and night to support the political ambitions of the great Sultan of Istanbul. Venetian and Ottoman trade interests were so enmeshed that formal trade agreements were set by treaty. They actually, you can take stuff through this port. Here's what we will pay for the right. Here's what you can tax us for the right, etc. The Ottomans sold wheat, spices, raw silk, cotton, and ash. And ash was used for glass making, which was beginning to develop in Venice out in Murano as a major industry. While Venice supplied finished goods such as soap, paper, and textiles, woolens that were coming from the Low Countries. Some Turkish carpets from this period are called, this is much like the Crivelli that I mentioned earlier, that are called Lotto for the artist Lotto, or Holbein, Hans Holbein the Younger. And we're going to get a lot of him later on, because the designs were featured in paintings by these artists. So the ones shown here are all designs from about the year 1500, as closely as they can be dated. Can you imagine what these things are worth now? They're still in unbelievable condition. The Phoenix and Dragon design, an animal pattern, and the middle one, the Ushak or star design. And this you'll see in a couple of different places in Holbein paintings. It's called, they call it, rug historians call it the Holbein pattern, because that's where they see it first. They see it in Holbein paintings. Anyhow, so there's a cultural transition that takes place in the 14th century, which we're really going to be talking about in great detail next week. A society that is moving from one that's dominated by monastic culture, by feudal economic and financial relationships, a manorial society with lords ruling over large agrarian tracts, to an urban society that's doing capitalist trade all over the world, building up banking conventions, by which I mean they have to invent banking. How do you get money to Damascus to pay for stuff? They have to invent promissory notes and letters of exchange and the like. So a society is moving from one focus to another, and requirements for the new society are going to be very different, by which I mean the intellectual requirements, the cultural requirements, are going to be very different than they were from a world in which monasteries, universities, and lords of the manor dominated the universe. So instead of on an intellectual level, on an educational level, instead of reading Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Jerome, the rule of St. Benedict, suddenly, hey, I've got clerks all over Florence and Venice and my new banking enterprise. They got to learn how to draft letters. They got to learn how to write treaties, court invitations. Part of the new business is the business of diplomacy. Part of the new business is as I say here, is the business of business. I need contracts. I need letters of credit. I need commercial proposals. I need people literate in a language that is understood on both ends. So we use Latin at this point because none of the Western vernacular languages travel far. Italian didn't exist. It was called, in this period, it would be called Tuscan. But what was spoken in the Papal States and what was spoken in Modena and what was spoken in Milan were such different versions, not to mention places like Spain, they've documented, Castilian wins, but it isn't that Latin corrupts into Castilian. It's that Latin in the ancient world corrupted into something like 25 Romance languages, all within the Iberian Peninsula, and that eventually Castilian became the dominant one for political reasons. But people would have trouble understanding people from 5 towns over. So Latin was going to be the language of business, but it was not going to be the Latin of Thomas Aquinas trying to prove the existence of God by rational means. It's not going to be that technically special philosophical Latin. No, where can we turn to learn a Latin that is useful for business, commercial, and political enterprises? Well, let's turn to the Latin of the Roman Empire, which had business and political enterprises like the ones that are beginning to emerge again. So the business of culture also to ornament the Italian courts and the houses of the great families is also going to point to Roman educational methods, Roman models, Roman sources. Traditional educational methods, models, and institutions, as inherited from the Middle Ages, are inadequate. The medieval focus on monastic schools, philosophical disputation, devotional source material doesn't serve a new urban capitalist society and its requirements. So, here is going to be the great 14th century shift. And the shift, I know some treatments, traditional treatments of the Renaissance, or other historical periods for that matter, they would have you believe that people woke up one day and changed their minds. Oh, I think now I'm going to be secular, whereas before I was religious. No. What happens is real life concerns gets you using other sources, and then those other sources which you've now taken up for, as I highlight on the write-up here, stylistic concerns, like you want to write letters and do business writing. You're a lawyer and you want to do contracts and legal documents, or you're interested in new literary models. The stylistic shift gets you reading a different literature that's going to be helpful to you. And as you move towards that different literature, you're going to pick up the values of that literature. In other words, you're going to be shaped by what you're reading and thinking about and tending to. So if it's a letter of Cicero to his brother discussing the wonderful dinner party that he was at the previous week with some other Roman senators and that upstart Pompey, and what the conversation was about, well, you're going to start entertaining that as a point of interest. And suddenly, deconstructing the book of the Apocalypse at the end of the New Testament is not going to be a primary interest. So instead of, and on the left, in the big box on the left, I describe, or I list the sources that would have been of great interest to people in the high Middle Ages who were engaged in philosophical pursuits and religious pursuits in the monasteries, in the episcopal courts, in the papacy itself. There would have been the church fathers. So St. Jerome, the translator of the New Testament into Latin, Augustine of Hippo, who was the Platonically influenced philosopher Christian, who became the dominant philosopher of Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. Ambrose of Milan, Pope Gregory the Great. There'd be monastic writers, beginning with Benedict, but then Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century. Meister Eckhart, the mystic Benedictine. Hildegard of Bingen, the mystic nun, with her devotional, poetic songs and speculations. There would have been the philosophy sources themselves. Again, Augustine, Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas, Bonaventure, William of Ockham. What are people going to start reading when the new kind of secular Latin becomes the interest? They're going to start reading Cicero. Let's read politics and discussions of literature that we find in Seneca, Pliny the Younger. Let's read the histories of Rome by that Greek historian Polybius, who's translated into Latin. Let's read the major historians, Plutarch, Tacitus, Polybius again. Let's study what Roman education worked. Let's read Quintilian and learn how to produce orators. Let's read Quintilian and learn how to use memory palaces, the great memory techniques, which will be of great interest to the Renaissance, since it's only halfway through that book production begins to displace the arch need for memory, massive feats of memory, when books had still to be passed around. Let's read Cicero, the greatest orator of the ancient Roman world, as he discusses how the great political orator makes his points and wins his he's sort of the Martin Vincent Peale of his day. How to make friends and influence enemies. Let's read literature for pleasure. Let's read Virgil and Catullus and Ovid. Let's read the great De Rerum Natura, the great 12,000 line book on the universe by Lucretius, when it gets rediscovered, which is sort of midway through the Renaissance. So there's this shift for stylistic concerns. There was no attitude shift that caused the Renaissance. There was a shift in practice that then shifted attitude. So the attitude secularized because the educated were reading secular writing. They didn't wake up and say, I want to be secular. They woke up and said, I'm going to read Cicero today, at the end of which much of the subject area that they were thinking about was secular. So an interest in humanism is a result of the rediscovery of the ancient sources. It's not a cause of Renaissance, it's a result. Or you remember way back in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan's great adage, the medium is the message, arguing that the way your mind forms around content was determined by the medium itself. And the medium now is Roman secular literature that they're reading. And then on the final side, you get a chance for any questions and the like. And I see there are a couple of chats that I've ignored up until now. But on the last slide, and this stylistic and technical interest, I should say, that we find in literature, of course, is going to be applied in the plastic arts. So perspective is going to be, how did they do that? The Renaissance figures. Here's the great Piero della Francesca, The Flagellation of Christ. How did they get that right? And it's the flagellation of Christ. It doesn't look like a whole lot of religious stuff is going on to me in this picture. It looks like Piero trying to figure out how did they get that right, and doing a fine old job of getting it right, and a fine old job of capturing facial features and not just the details of perspective. So that's really what I wanted to cover in the introduction. What I would like to do is stop the share and here, have I, pardon me, I'm just going to make sure I remove the pin so you guys can all see one another. And let's, the chats that I skipped, oh, where did they go? One was bringing up where the cucumber comes from. Cucumber, they mentioned cucumber seeds and the phallic symbol of the cucumber might have been. And what was the other chat? All of a sudden, my chat button has disappeared from the screen.
Oh, then I had mentioned that there are Renaissance era cathedrals in some of the Proto-Italian republics that show clear Islamic influence.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. And well, indeed, when we talk about, I don't know that I have a heavy focus on it here because I'm doing more with Northern Italy, but certainly in places like, Palermo um, where you had Arab culture and Norman culture living side by side for a couple of centuries. You have, like the great church of Monreale and Palermo, which is sort of half mosque and half church, and San Marco itself in Venice.
Yeah, there's also some in Spain too, some gorgeous
Oh
ones.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the thing with the cucumbers, you probably know, I mean, the idea way back when, where the reason self-abuse, shall we say, has always been considered a sin, is way back when they literally thought that the male ejaculate contained tiny little babies. So that would be the idea of where the, like I said, the cucumber with the phallic shape and the seeds. Again, that was just a stab in the dark. What's that?
I said, you mean it doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. But it's just a stab in the dark, because that would be the only, you had said that you didn't really know why, and that just having been educated in all those traditions, it occurred to me that makes as much sense as anything.
Thank you. I like it. Sounds pretty good. That's the great thing about a good theory. It doesn't have to be true as long as it works.
Exactly.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Laurie, you were going to say something.
So, I understand that business people would need to consult secular resources, but how did it happen that it engulfed kind of the entire community enough that it made such a shift?
Well, it's and it's a point I should have made. I'm glad you brought this up. It's an elite development. And it's only going to be among elites for a couple of centuries. Certainly until printing and the dissemination of printed works because of the Reformation, which I've got a whole session on. It's in the beginning, it's about elites. And one of the points I'm making is it's that the elite itself, which includes those high-level craftsmen that we think of as artists, are themselves extensions of that elite. It's the banking interests, it's the trading interests, it's the great families that fight to install their own cousins as the Pope. All those rivalries in central Italy over who gets to be the next Pope.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah.
But it really is an elite manifestation.
Hey, Lou, just an oddball question. How much of this was redistribution of wealth? The church had the wealth, and the secular part of population wanted their share. It's almost like today.
But it really wasn't a redistribution in that it was a sort of a secular high-level aggregation. In other words, it wasn't like what do they call it? A zero-sum game where it's being transferred. It's like new wealth is being invented and aggregated at such high levels that the papacy itself becomes, and the appointment of bishops and cardinals, for instance, becomes a pawn in the game of larger wealth. And one of the things we're going to see is that the biggest banking families, and I'll talk about the Medici in their place, but even more dramatically, the Fuggers in Germany,
Yeah.
who because they become the bank rollers of major wars and imperial systems, they raise the game to another level. Jakob Fugger, the patriarch of the family, I saw in an article a modern writer taking a total flyer at a guess, but estimated that it would be the equivalent of a modern fortune of like $500 billion. Like richer than the Bezoses and the whomevers of our present world. Susan, you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, this is a little bit off, but I've been thinking about if all of this stuff happened for banking and to support trade and the movement of capital in a sense, what did they do before that? Were people trading only with commodities like I brought this and or gold, or what were they trading with? What was
it would have been, oh, I see, before you had letters of credit and the like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you would have had to have people, send their nephew with a couple of armed guards and a little bag of jewels.
Oh, they really did it like that.
Oh, they really had to. And then, of course, you had in the Mediterranean, you also had and it was the reason you often had the so-called court Jews, was that you had Jewish banking interests who had relatives all over North Africa and into the Levant and in Western Europe, who could be used as, if you will, guarantors. I'll send a letter to my cousin in Thessalonica and have him, when those goods are delivered, have him give you so many sovereigns for it.
Yeah, Lou, can I just add that? Yeah. So what I think essentially happened was that there was a transfer of religious power to secular power. And as the banking families emerged, and the ones in Ukraine, the Rothschilds and so forth, they branched out. They had, there was a brother in Paris, there was one in Germany, they had these, and those banking families, wherever their wealth came from, it could be from grain dealing in Ukraine or wherever it was, or the trade routes. They had the bankroll to finance the wars, whereas the powers that be became their vassals in a sense, because they owed money. And then everyone in this society, it filtered down so that everyone in this society owned allegiance to the bankers, essentially, or the wealth. And the wealth was no longer in the church; it was in the commercial sector. So which
is why the artists of the period made money from family to family,
and the artists became the promoters of this new class.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, as we're going to see, much of the art produced in this period were, if you will, statements of one's own significance. Yeah. Not as the artist, but as the patron who sponsored the artwork.
And as you showed in those slides of the intricate woodwork and the fabrics and all of that, and how wealthy a city was and so forth to attract business, it was all PR.
All PR. And the thing I love about the Crivelli is that we're not talking about Florence and we're not talking about Venice. We're talking about little Ascoli Piceno. It's as if you have the local booster talking about Montclair.
Well, why not?
And why not? And why not? Any other?
I remember in one of our last classes, there was a artwork that you discussed prominently where someone was holding a model of the city. I don't remember what class it was and what artwork,
right.
But
that was quite common.
Yeah. Interesting. Yep.
Anybody else, or else we're just about out of time?
What wasn't, I mean, weren't those various duchies or dukedoms, whatever they republics, weren't they highly competitive with each other too?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
And,
that's what,
and,
yeah,
and,
so that,
and they were often at war with each other over
Right.
things like trade dominance, and
Right.
but often they were often at war within themselves. So you find rival families within Florence contending with what, people like Dante were exiled from
right.
Florence because he was on the losing side. He backed the wrong faction in town. But certainly city to city, and indeed many of the significant people that we will look at, members of the Sforza family, Federico da Montefeltro, these were who we think of as major dukes of cities. They were mercenaries who made their wealth by lending their armies out to the heads of other cities. And they got paid well enough to set up, dominance of
And they,
they were.
Lou, and they also, and these mercenaries also got paid in what was conquered. They got part of the bounty.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's where the really great wealth was made.
Absolutely.
Aren't
I-
the paleos of today, aren't they kind of a remnant of some of that rivalry? Or am I mistaken?
The which, I'm
The
sorry.
paleos, those big events that they have the races and
Oh, the
different tribes and everybody has a different flag.
Yeah, those are the neighborhood rivalries that you'll get in a number of the Renaissance cities that were probably reflective of entire clans that dominated certain neighborhoods. In Florence, they're called the contrade, those different sections.
But they have ancient roots there in this.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought.
Totally.
Okay.
Anyhow,
Well, that was enlightening.
Yeah, great.
And look forward.
we'll regather next week.